Hello, my name is Dr. Jana Chismash. I'm a reader at the York Law School and the Centre for Applied Human Rights in the UK. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the IHL annual meeting session titled There and Back Again, How to Ensure Compliance with IHL by Relying on Non-Traditional Voices and Live to Tell the Tale. If you speculated based on this very creative title that you're in for a treat today, you're right. Our interdisciplinary panel bridges academia and practice and will reflect on innovative modalities, processes, and potentialities of strengthening compliance with humanitarian norms in times of armed conflict. Our speakers are Jean-Marie Henkert, the head of the ICRC project to update the commentaries on the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols of 1977. So far, 3 of the commentaries have been published. In 2016, the commentary on the first Geneva Convention, in 2017, the commentary on the second Geneva Convention, and in 2020, so very fresh off the press, the updated commentary on the third Geneva Convention. And as any good governmental lawyer, student, scholar, practitioner of IHL knows, Jean-Marie was previously the head of the ICRC project on customary international humanitarian law that we all follow closely and teach in class. Tanisha Fazal is professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Her scholarship focuses on sovereignty, international law, and armed conflict. Her current research examines the effect of improvements in medical care in conflict zones on the long-term costs of war. She has authored several award-winning publications, among which Wars of Law, Unintended Consequences in the Regulation of Armed Conflict, which was published in 2018 with Cornell University Press and which I strongly recommend. Pascal Bongard is the head of the policy and legal unit of Geneva Co. He has extensive experience in humanitarian engagement with armed non-state actors, what Geneva calls ANSAs and others, of course, and has published widely on these issues. Sorry for that, not wildly, widely. Pascal is also the co-investigator of a very creative research project with the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, which is funded by UCRI in the UK, on ANSA's practice and interpretation of IHL. And finally, we have Dr. Nontando Hadebe, who is a woman theologian and a member of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, which was founded in Accra in Ghana in 1989, with the aim to respond to gender inequality in religion and culture and its impact on different contexts in Africa. She has been awarded prestigious fellowships and taught courses in gender and theology. She's based in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she teaches part-time at the St. Augustine College, is a facilitator with the FOKISA program on the church's responses to violence against LGBTIQ in Southern Africa. And she also has a weekly radio program with Radio Veritas, a local Catholic radio station. As to the format of the discussions today, I have the privilege to address a question to each of the speakers, and they will respond in 5 to 7 minutes. And I'll be very strict with those 5 to 7 minutes. Following on this question and answer session, we are looking forward to an interactive discussion between the panelists. And don't forget, after this interactive discussion, the audience can engage with the panelists during the continuing the conversation session. So this leaves me with a great task of asking Jean-Marie, what is the impact of the commentaries on compliance with humanitarian norms?
Thank you, Jona, and good afternoon, everyone. So without further ado, I will try to answer that question. But first, of course, I need to explain a little bit what commentaries are, because commentaries are a particular genre in international legal scholarship, alongside others like essays, law review articles, treatises covering a whole field of the law, and monographs maybe on a specific topic. So each of these genres has specific features that structure and present the law in a certain way, and also that influence then the questions that are asked and the answers that are given. So a commentary being a book that discusses in national law statutes and in international law treaties, article by article, in a structured manner. So each article is discussed in detail, and the links between the various provisions and other rules of international law are explained. So a commentary then applies a method of interpretation to explain what these rules mean. And in my opinion, this method is actually geared towards compliance because the rules that are applied, they emanate from the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is based itself on the rule that treaties must be respected. So that's the starting point. But then looking deeper into this Vienna Convention law of treaties, specifically on the rules of treaty interpretation, I believe looking at these, we also see that actually the various elements of treaty interpretation are geared towards serving this ultimate goal of the Vienna Convention, namely that treaties must be respected. Because the rules on treaty interpretation say that treaties have to be interpreted in good faith. And that's, of course, one of the primary requirements, right, to get proper compliance and application of the rules in good faith, and then in compliance or following the ordinary meaning of the terms in their context. So this, in my opinion, also shows that the objective is to apply the convention as it is written and not to divert from its meaning. In accordance with the ordinary meaning of the terms in their context, and in light of the object and purpose of the treaty. And so these two elements of ordinary meaning and object and purpose, in my opinion, reflect the idea that treaties have to be applied according to not only the letter, but also the spirit. And so I think these basic rules on treaty interpretation that are applied in a commentary further enhance actually or advance the cause of applying and complying with treaties. Then there are a few additional elements in treaty interpretation that I will mention now and come back to in a minute. So the first one is also taking into account subsequent practice in the interpretation of treaties. And in my opinion, that also enhances compliance because it allows treaties to evolve over time and to adapt to, for example, technological and other evolutions. And finally, in treaty interpretation, we have to look at other relevant rules of international law. And this serves to ensure the integrity of the whole field of international law to avoid gaps and contradictions. So applying this method in good faith of treaty interpretation in and of itself, in my opinion, enhances or advances compliance with treaties. Then commentaries as a genre, are specifically addressed to practitioners and, in my opinion, can play a significant role in enhancing compliance because the purpose is to clarify the meaning of the norms so that they can be applied in a correct way and also in a more coherent way by presenting evidence and elements that explains and supports an interpretation. And in so doing also, of course, trying to ensure that treaties beyond the mere terms of the conventions are interpreted in a more coherent manner by the various actors that operate in this field, in particular in the field of international humanitarian law, so being state actors, international organizations, judges, NGOs, and so forth. So the idea is to present these elements of interpretation to ensure that a correct interpretation is followed. Commentaries have the advantage also that they're comprehensive, so they are not area per area or on a specific topic, like maybe case law may clarify certain rules, but commentaries seek to clarify an entire treaty and also, as I explained before, the links between the various articles in treaties and in the wider field. So they are a practical tool that bring together these various elements and propose these interpretations. They're not always new interpretations, but they bring them together in a systematic way so that everything is together in one place and shows the links and the between the various provisions. So in doing so, and specifically in the area of bringing together subsequent practice and other relevant rules of international law, I think that from my experience, at least, commentaries provide examples of application, of challenges, of best practices, and how rules have been implemented. So they record actually best practice from previous conflicts, so these can be accessed and can be used by practitioners. For example, government lawyers, including military lawyers, when reviewing national doctrine, for example, as I now have knowledge of a state reviewing its doctrine on prisoners of war and using the commentary on the Third Geneva Convention, or national judges, for example, Stockholm District Court in 2017, looking at whether non-state armed groups have the authority to set up courts, or just recently in Colombia, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace that looked at our commentary for the definition of hostage taking. Then there are international judges, for example, the ICC, and there are examples there, or international civil servant, international organizations such as the UN, NGOs, the ICRC itself. Of course, we rely on these commentaries to ensure a coherent interpretation and application of the law. And finally, also academics. One minor point maybe, but others will fill in on this, of course, commentaries seem to me not to reflect, at least so far, a big role for non-state armed group practice. We only so far had to deal with this in the framework of Common Article 3. But the doctrines of sources and interpretation of international law favor states at the exclusion of non-state armed groups. And so this is something certainly we will have to look at more in the framework of Additional Protocol 2, and also to look at what the value is of the humanitarian commitments that non-state armed groups make. There's a lot of discussion about that, an increasing level of debate amongst scholars, but the precise juridical value of these instruments remains unclear. But there is, of course, a tendency not to overlook them. And we have also looked at them, and also, of course, you can look at them to see how courts and states react to them. And that's then certainly part of the traditional doctrines of interpretation and application of the law. So in conclusion, I would say that commentaries are in a way a tool to increase compliance, and that's certainly why we're updating the commentaries, is ultimately to seek better respect and compliance with the law. And we have seen evidence of this from the previous commentaries, but also again from the new ones, the updated ones, in a few examples that I've mentioned from Stockholm, the ICC, or maybe update of a military manual. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for this fascinating insights and on the commentaries as a genre. I really like that, and especially as a tool in an anarchic world. And we come, therefore, to another discipline that provides us with great insights into compliance. Tanisha, who is coming with political science insights and IR insights. Based on your research, Tanisha, what factors drive states and non-state armed groups' compliance with humanitarian norms?
Thanks, Joanna, and thanks also for inviting me to participate on this panel. So I'm going to focus on the non-state armed group, and I'm going to use armed non-state actor, non-state armed group, rebel group. I'm going to use these terms interchangeably in my remarks. But I'm happy to talk about state compliance as well, as we discuss afterward. And I'm going to, when we think about international humanitarian law, I'm going to focus on the issue of civilian targeting, again, for reasons of time, but also because I think it's the issue that we tend to care about the most, and it receives a lot of attention. And what I want to do is kind of talk about a framework for thinking about why it is that some non-state armed groups target civilians while others don't. And the basic argument that I want to make is that what you're fighting for conditions how you fight. And so we have to look at the political aims of these groups to understand whether or not they're going to target civilians, or the likelihood of them targeting civilians. And I think about these groups or these aims in 4 different categories. The first category are what I'm going to call resource rebels. And these are the rebel groups that they're sort of mercenary by definition. They're the ones that want to maintain control over a diamond mine or an oil refinery, but they have sort of very limited territorial ambitions for that reason. And while they can be pretty ruthless in the areas where they do exert territorial control, they tend not to bother you if you don't bother them, as long as you're also not interrupting their access to the black market. And so these groups target civilians some, but actually not the most. The next set of groups are what I call center-seeking rebels. And this is the sort of traditional rebel group that wants to take over the capital and replace the government. And here, I think this is a category of rebel group where you do see a lot of civilian targeting along the lines of what Stathis Kalavas argues in his book, The Logic of Violence and Civil War, where these rebels will target civilians kind of in their rear in order to keep them in line, but they will also engage in a lot of indiscriminate targeting for civilians that they see as supporting their opponents in order to try and intimidate them into joining their side. And then the third category of armed non-state actors or rebel groups where I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about are secessionist rebel groups. And I argue and find actually that secessionist rebel groups are considerably less likely to target civilians compared to other kinds of rebel groups. In fact, up to 30% less likely. And I think that there is both a political reason for this and also a military strategic reason for this. And the political reason does have to do with international humanitarian law, which is to say that secessionist groups want to signal to the international community that they will be good and capable members of that community if they're let into the club. And they believe that if they both comply and advertise that compliance with international humanitarian law, then that's going to increase the odds of successful secessionism. I actually think that belief is mistaken, but nonetheless, it appears that secessionist groups behave in this way. And the strategic or military reason for secessionist groups to refrain from targeting civilians is that the civilians that are most within their reach are the civilians that are meant to comprise the population of the new state that they would like to create. And so they don't want to target those civilians. And then if you think about what the civilians that might be next most available, those are civilians that are over the putative border with the state from which they're trying to secede. And one of the things that we know about civilian targeting in both wars between states and wars within states is that reciprocity is a really important predictor. So because secessionist groups tend to be pretty geographically concentrated, they know that if they target, again, over their putative border, that they're very vulnerable to a counterattack. So they have this kind of military strategic reason to avoid targeting civilians as well. But there is one important exception to this argument that secessionists don't target civilians or are less likely to target civilians, which is that they do certainly target ethnic minorities within the secessionist region. And the last set of groups I want to talk about are what I'm going to call religionist rebels. And I want to make a distinction, and I'll talk about this in a little bit as well, between what I'm going to call religionist rebels and religious rebels. So religionist rebels are rebels that don't accept the sovereign state system. And so they don't care about international law. And so we can, for these groups, sovereignty comes from the divine. The Islamic State, of course, is an example, but so are historical groups like the Yellow Cliffs rebels in mid-19th century China, the Canudos in late 19th century Brazil. More recently, you can think about the Holy Spirit movement forces in northern Uganda. So my point here is that this is not an exclusively modern phenomenon, these religionist groups, nor is it an exclusively Islamic phenomenon. And I think that's a really important point to underline because and here I want to pivot to talking about religious groups, not religionist groups, because there are so many civil wars in Muslim majority states today. I think it's very easy to confuse the issue. In fact, most civil wars today occur in Muslim majority states. And so it's worth thinking about whether groups that identify as Islamic but aren't necessarily religionist, which is really most Islamic armed groups, what their relationship is to international humanitarian law. And so along with my colleagues, Amelia Powell and Jessica Stanton, I've been looking at this question. And one of the things that we found in a more legal analysis is that there's a lot of overlap between international humanitarian law, or public international humanitarian law, along the lines of what Jean-Marie was just talking about, and Islamic humanitarian law, substantively. We're also finding that a lot of these self-identified Islamic armed groups very clearly state their allegiance to Islamic humanitarian law. But when it comes down to behavior, they're not actually behaving very differently from non-Islamic armed groups, even when there are differences between Islamic humanitarian law and what you might think of as public international humanitarian law. Ultimately, it seems like political incentives really reign. So I'll just wrap up by saying that, from my perspective, again, what you're fighting for determines how you fight and also the extent to which you abide by international humanitarian law. So this is a very political perspective on law. And I think that this holds even for Islamic armed groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanisha, for this really incredible insights into your research and some of your findings. And I hope we can develop that further in the dialogue following the presentations. I'm turning now to Pascal. Drawing on your 20 years of experience in humanitarian practice, Pascal, could you provide us with some non-traditional illustrations of compliance generation?
Sure, many thanks, Joanna, for the kind introduction. I'm very pleased to participate in this panel discussion and would like to thank Azil for the invitation. In my intervention, I will focus on the role of non-state armed groups or armed non-state actors, as we also use at Geneva Call, and their constituencies in generating compliance with IHL. So my intervention is based mainly on my experience with Geneva Call over the past 20 years, as you say. And I will first talk about the positive influence that these non-traditional actors may have. And then I will conclude with some recommendation or ways forward. So as you know, we all know non-state armed groups do not operate in a vacuum. Most of them have some kind of support base or constituency. And this includes civil society organization, diaspora, refugee communities, mass-based organization. Sometimes armed groups are backed by foreign states or other armed groups. So it's very important to identify and engage these actors, that may have influence on the behavior of armed groups. And this is what we have been doing at Geneva Call for many years. And I will give you some illustration drawn from our practice on the landmine ban. Initially, Geneva Call was engaging on the landmine ban. It originated from the ICBL, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, and then he expanded on other issues. So let me give you some examples of actors that we have been engaging, and they have some influence on the behavior of armed groups. In South Sudan, for example, in the early 2000s, CBOs, women groups, churches, and other actors were very much instrumental in pushing the SPLA, the Sudan People Liberation Army, to initiate mine clearance in areas under its control, or so-called liberated areas. Some other movements have international solidarity networks. This is the case, for example, of the Sahrawi movement. And these support committees, very influential, very important, especially in Spain, who is used to be the former colonial power, help us to put pressure on the Polisario front to ban anti-personnel mines. And we have many other examples in other contexts. In Senegal, we engage refugee communities to support our advocacy efforts towards the Casamance rebels because they have some links, and it was very important to also engage with the local communities and refugee communities on both sides of the borders in the Gambia and Guinea-Bissau. We have also engaged with diaspora, for example, the Tamil diaspora, with little success, I must admit, as many members of the diaspora were justifying rather than denouncing the LTTE mine use policy. And they were dismissing violation of IHL as government propaganda. But another non-traditional actor that is often ignored are non-state armed groups themselves. They may positively influence each other. This is what we experience in many situations where armed groups we have been engaging were encouraging other groups to undertake similar humanitarian commitments. Often it was friendly groups, allied groups that were part of the same coalition, for example, the brigades of the Free Syrian Army or ethnic insurgent armed groups in Myanmar. But in other cases, the groups were operating in very different contexts, like PKK and FARC, but they were sharing similar goals or ideology. So PKK, who engaged with us on different issues, including child protection, the ban on landmines, tried to encourage the FARC during the peace talks in Cuba to reciprocate. So in order to foster this interaction, we often invite armed groups in Geneva to meet together to address IHL issues. And this is very interesting because such inter-armed groups meetings create peer pressure. And we have noticed that as a result, often there are new commitments made by armed groups we were behind. So armed groups may also influence not only other armed groups, but sometimes the policy of opposing states. Case in point is in Sudan, where the commitment made by the SPLA that I just mentioned was instrumental in the decision of the government to reciprocate and ratify the Ottawa Convention. So there were this kind of peer effect from non-state actors to the opposing states. And we had other examples in Iraq, for example, with the Kurdish opposition groups. In many contexts, non-state armed groups are backed by foreign states. So such sponsor states often have a significant leverage power and can be mobilized, we try at least, to push armed groups to respect humanitarian norms. Under Article 1 of the Geneva Convention, states parties have indeed a responsibility to comply, but also to ensure compliance with the conventions, especially with any actors, state or non-state, that they may support. So to conclude on our experience and the role of these non-traditional actors, I think our experience shows that peer pressure may be a valuable approach to promote compliance. The potential of this approach has been, I think, underutilized, and it would be, I think, worthwhile to explore more how and when non-state armed groups may influence positively other parties to conflict. Second, and this is my last point, we also know little about the dynamics between armed groups and their constituencies, whether they are local communities, diaspora, refugee communities, or civil society actors. And I think this support base, as I've been trying to say, may play a moderating role, not always, but they may have a positive role. And it depends, of course, on factors like to what extent armed groups are dependent on these constituencies' support for the survival, but often the primary restraining influence is internal to the group. This is something that we have also noticed during the course of the research that you mentioned on the practice and interpretation of IHL by armed groups. We could see, for example, in the case of the Tuareg independentist movement, the MNLA in Mali, how much the local communities, but also activists within the movement that were very much sensitive to human rights and the reputation of the group play a very instrumental role in moderating the behavior of this group in the battlefield. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal, both for giving us examples, illustrations, and reflections of potential influencers, actors that act as influencers of non-state armed groups, but also for what I perceive as a call for scholars to investigate further these various processes and actors. Thank you very much. We should then give the floor, I almost said, but I mean the screen, to Nontando on a topic that piques the interest of many of us, and that is, what is the role of religion and religious value in compliance with the law?
I also want to say greetings to my fellow panelists, as well as the participants in this conference, and to say thank you for the invitation. I think to begin by saying that religion plays a very important role in the continent of Africa. We've got three main religions: Islam, Christianity and African traditional religions. And when you look at the international humanitarian law and the emphasis on humanity, it echoes the ideals of religion, Christianity, Islam, human beings created in the image of God, the dignity of humanity, the protection of life, the sacredness of life, and just honoring the other. But in reality, religion is also its own enemy. Before the conflict begins, the seeds that push the conflict are already planted in our religions. Because if you look at our religions like Christianity or the major religions, there is a claim that the particular religion has got a monopoly on the divine. And so it instills in its followers a kind of inclusive, a feeling that you have the truth yourself, and that anyone else who's outside of your group does not have the truth, is not, to be considered. In some cases, they're not even considered as an equal human being. And so in the intricacies of the beliefs themselves are already seeds of war. Because you find that sometimes religions, they will call each other names and descriptions that create this antagonism among the religion, within the religions, so that the followers even believe that by despising or compromising the humanity of the other, that they are actually following God. So that really needs to start right at that beginning, so that when the conflict flares up and the person sees and they see each other on the battlefield, they're already been indoctrinated to believe that the other person is in opposition to their faith, is not equivalent, doesn't deserve to be respected, or the human dignity. That's why we witness such impunity and such cruelty, as we saw in the genocide in Rwanda and so many wars between religious groups. And it starts there in the doctrines themselves of exclusivity and rejection of difference. And I think when we grasp that, we begin to understand why on the battlefields people have no problem in being cruel, in being heartless against those that they are fighting against. So those seeds in the religion really need to be unpacked. And then you already have systems of inequality in religion, particularly when it comes to gender. And that's what we as women theologians interrogate. That already in the religion is the devaluing of women's lives. And we're not even going to talk about LGBTI because they are not in the radar of humanity. So already you have inside the religion itself those kind of teachings and attitudes, so that in the battlefield, the devaluing, the mass rape of women that we witnessed in the DRC, and the whole, and when we're thinking about violence against women, we can think, that rape is like on the top of the agenda, but there are so many forms. Just the dismissal of women's views, that the exclusion of women in the participation of all aspects. And even today, where we find that there are female combatants who are active in the war, but even when they are doing the same work as the male counterparts, because the religion, the culture in which people are steeped in already devalues women, sees them as less than men, so that in every aspect, whether women want to contribute, their voices are not given that kind of legitimacy. And so that's why I'm saying that religion becomes its own enemy, even when on the other hand, there is the belief in the dignity of people, belief in the value of life, but there are also these these beliefs, right, that are driving, that are making religious wars so vicious. And we have a history. Like I'm Christian, if we look at Christian history, it's just about a lot of war. There's war, cruelty at really levels that are very difficult to reconcile with what we believe. And so I want to make that point to say that's where it starts. But just before we give up hope, religion is also evolutionary. It changes and it's transformed. And that's why we as women theologians really get into the battle for the dignity of women and the equality of all persons, and to hold religions accountable to the basic beliefs in the dignity and equality of all. So that's where we really are active. But we're beginning to see a maturation of religions. We're beginning to see across the continent groups working together across religious divides. We are seeing a lot of interfaith, interreligious work that is coming together and protesting and speaking and reversing these fundamental theologies that create people who see the other as an enemy and devalue their lives as part of a religious expression. So we're seeing a lot of changes within religions themselves. We are seeing the upliftment of women, and the circle is very much involved in these issues, because we've got to get the house right so that even in the battlefield, then the laws can be respected because they've already been taught prior. So this is happening, and this is where the hope is. The examples of so many interreligious, leaders coming together to speak, to address national issues or even wars, and intervening. And so I will end there to say that there is continuity between the ideals of religion and the international humanitarian laws, and that religion itself becomes its own enemy through division and intolerance, but that there are movements to be able to reverse that tide, and we are seeing fruits of that everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nontando. I think I abused the word fascinating today. This is probably the first time I'm saying it, but I can't help myself. It's not my limited vocabulary here the problem. It really is a fascinating panel. So thank you very much for that. Your input on religion is also very close to my heart and my research interest, as I'm leading the Generating Respect project, which in fact looks into the role of religious leaders in influencing parties to the conflict. But enough about that. Let me, instead of me summing up, I think we should keep the discussion going. And I'd like to open the screen to questions from the panelists to the panelists. So I'm wondering, Nontando, who spoke last, Nontando, would you like to start the discussion with a question to one of the panelists?
Sorry, I had forgotten that I'm on mute. I was looking, and I think the two speakers, I think it was Professor Fazal and Pascal and Jean Marie, you were talking about the importance of a common interpretation of the treaties, and so that they can be applied in the countries, and also examples that you were giving of armed groups and the conflicts that are happening in Africa, and how do you see the role of religious leaders or other activists in understanding and interpreting the treaties, because most of the time they're quite abstract, and people, and governments don't see themselves involved in that, and how we can draw together these commonalities and critique one another. What are you thinking around that?
Yona, is that for me? Yes, okay. Yes, no, thank you for that question. I mean, in my opinion, religious leaders have an important role to play in ensuring compliance with IHL. First of all, there are, there's religious personnel within the armed forces, for example. So for state armed forces, that's a vector for them to actually ensure compliance with the law, but then also in communities and vis-a-vis non-state armed groups, of course, religious leaders have an influence. So I think that this topic of how to ensure better compliance is very comprehensive, and I think that everyone has a role to play. So Pascal talked about civil society, for example. He himself is working for an NGO. We're working for the Red Cross. you have religious leaders, then there are also journalists, and there is youth. So I think that, you know, if all of these, you know, pull together and work in the same direction, I think that that will have an impact. Of course, compliance with humanitarian law, or, you know, we shouldn't kid ourselves, will never be perfect, because we're dealing with the worst of the worst situations of violence, of course, where people are pursuing goals to destroy property and even kill armed groups and armed forces on the other side. So it, you know, it's a very chaotic situation, and it can be, you know, it's not sort of human and humanitarian to begin with, but what the rules of humanitarian law try to do is to minimize the suffering and to bring a little bit of restraint in those situations to avoid the rape and the genocide that you refer to. And so I think that, you know, what humanitarian law does is already set the limits out on paper, so to speak, and commentaries, for example, and other kinds of legal work, then clarify what those rules mean. And then you have religious leaders and the media and civil society groups and NGOs that have to sort of translate that message into reality to bring it closer to people. And I think that, yeah, today we at least, even though we see a lot of violations still continuing, we are all very clear about what the baseline is and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So I think, but to answer your question specifically, is that I think that, yes, religious leaders have a role to play in this at various levels, and they're also, as I mentioned, have a role to play within the armed forces themselves. I don't know vis-a-vis armed groups if they have this type of personnel embedded in armed groups that may exist, but certainly some of these groups are very much influenced, and much more influenced, you know, by the teachings and advice from religious leaders rather than you know, legal advisors, lawyers, or states, because some of them, as we heard, they even reject the sovereign state. So they will say, we take our rules directly from God. So if then someone can interpret these rules from God and explain to them that killing innocent civilian is also not allowed by the rules of God, then of course you're much further than by quoting the Geneva Conventions or coming with a thick book of commentaries. So each situation is different, but I think we have to take a comprehensive view of the question. Lawyers certainly don't have all the answers to this question, and we need international relations to understand why rules are violated and respected. And we need all types of organizations, from the UN, the Red Cross, NGOs, Geneva Call, and religious organizations, to also work towards this common goal. And I would also again underline the role of the media to call out on certain, I mean, to be well trained and, you know, about what humanitarian law is. And it's a continuing challenge to make sure that this is achieved.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. I'm sorry to interrupt you there.
No, I was finished.
Comprehensive answer with a holistic view. I think underlining that these actors can be influencers, and what you said, translators of the commentaries and in general of IHL, is a really, really important point. I'm wondering if you have a question for one of the panelists.
Yes, I have many questions for all the panelists actually, but I will start with one question for Tanisha, because what she was presenting was very interesting, the way she divided the rebel groups. And so to explain what they do is informed by what objectives they pursue. And then I was thinking about a study which you probably may be familiar, Roots of Restraint, that the ICRC published in 2018. And this, I'm not an expert on this study, but this study divided armed groups, and state armed forces were also included, but divided them among three categories of centralized armed groups, decentralized armed groups, and community embedded armed groups. And so the more you go down from centralized to decentralized with various splinter groups and smaller groups, and then community embedded being groups of people who are actually in a community but then go out and do fighting. So the more you go down and have less and less of a central command system and a disciplinary system, the less importance will be given to international law rules, to IHL, and that the ways to ensure respect may be different. So I wonder how this interacts with, the different types of rebels. So if we could even have a mix of these two models and then see, I don't know if she's thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Marie. That's a great question. So let me say first that the framework I presented is, of course, ideal types, and no one group is purely one thing or another. And you could certainly interact centralized versus decentralized versus community engaged groups as well. I think then you get a really complicated table. I'd have to get out my calculator and see how many cells that table would produce. But, I will say that, I'll go on record, probably, I might regret this later, but I'm not the biggest fan of the Roots of Restraint project, because I think it makes sense that groups that are more decentralized are going to see less discipline when it comes to complying with IHL. I don't think that there is as much variation among in that variable of decentralization as we might think. I think most groups are decentralized. And so, at least today. And so for that reason, I'm not sure that particular factor gives us as much leverage as we would hope on this question.
Thank you very much, Tanisha. Really interesting on the structure of this decentralization and centralization. Would be really nice to continue this conversation. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Well, like Jean-Marie, I have so many questions, but I'm going to pose one to Pascal, if that's okay. So Pascal, I was really intrigued by your discussion of the use of peer pressure to improve compliance. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about whether you think that some groups, just, anecdotally and without naming names, whether some groups or types of groups are either more or less likely to apply peer pressure than other groups, or more or less likely to be receptive to peer pressure than other groups.
Thank you, Tanisha, for this quite difficult question, because it's always difficult to generalize and to draw, definitive conclusion. I think my experience during over the past years is that there is so much counterexamples that at the end of the day is always difficult to find some kind of trends or rules. But I think to respond to your question, there are different types of groups that may be more susceptible to exert pressure on others. Either they belong to the same network. For example, you have the international Maoist movement. So they are all gathering, meetings, exchanging experiences, sometimes inviting each others. And I was always fascinated to see sometimes when I went to, the NAM group office, pictures or flags of other movements that is inspiring the struggle. So I will not give any names, but I think you have this type of connections. Either it is on ideological basis, ethnic basis, it could be different correlation. Just give you maybe another example of a situation I experienced actually personally. When the first time we engaged with the justice and equality movement, one of the various Darfur movements, they were part of the same Sudanese Revolutionary Front, coalition of the three main Darfur rebel groups, plus the Sudan People Liberation Movement North in the Nuba Mountains. And it was interesting because they were all knowing each other, and the justice and equality movement at that time was a bit more advanced in terms of engagement on the child protection issues, and they signed an MOU with UNICEF here in Geneva. So we capitalize, or we use on this connections to then be introduced to the other movements. And they organized, they facilitated the contacts and the introduction in Kampala, actually, with the other movements. And it was very, this is the best, type of starting point for us, because we are introduced by their peers or people that they trust. So it's very easy then, we are in a kind of, in a very good hands to start a dialogue on our own with the different movements. So I think, I think this is a different type of situation when you have some groups that are more susceptible to engage in this kind of peer pressure or influence. But again, I remember also another anecdote. It was in Nairobi in 2004, on the fringe of a meeting of state parties to the Ottawa Convention. And at that time, the SPLA and the Sudanese government were making peace. And they agree on a demining effort, a joint demining effort, it was brokered by the UN. And the two parties, the SPLA and the government, try to convince the vice president of Colombia to do the same. It was 2004, so 12 years before the peace agreement between Colombia and the FARC. And it was interesting to see that these belligerent parties, they felt like they had a kind of interesting experience. They wanted also to emulate or to share with other parties that were involved in a similar type of conventional NIAC between opposition force and the government. So I think it depends on the type of groups, but probably to conclude, the groups that may be aspiring to statehood, taking some state responsibilities, and they feel they have this kind of maybe legal responsibility to also encourage and influence other parties that are friends or that they feel are in a similar situation.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Do you have a question?
Yes, I was interested I found Nantando experience very, very interesting and very insightful. And you were talking about the role of religious leaders. And I was wondering whether there are some types of scenario or circumstances where you feel that the influence of religious leaders, including female leaders, is the strongest on the battlefield. Are there some types of situations that are more conducive? And are there, maybe this is the second question, are there some types of norms or thematics or values that you feel have been more well received or accepted coming from religious leaders when you try to influence or engage with the different parties to a conflict?
Thank you. Nontando?
Thank you very much for those questions. I will start with the last question. I think when religious leaders speak with one voice, like say for example, there's they speak. Let's say the conflict includes people of different faiths, like in the case of maybe like Nigeria or and then you'll have not just a Christian leader but also a Muslim leader, and I think that's what's happening when there's this interfaith that is representing the religions of those that are in conflict. It becomes much more powerful because it means that the leaders are giving a different message to say that and it's not happening as much as we would like, but I think it provides an example. Like just here in South Africa, in terms of like apartheid, it was the leaders deciding that we share common value, and therefore in our communities we are going to teach people that our differences do not have to define us, that we are standing on the same platform. And so when that happens, when leaders speak together on issues or to their followers, then that has a better potential. And also even there are some values in African traditional religions like Ubuntu, that affirm the interconnectedness or the interdependence on people. And so even to say that person that you just shot of a different political party is actually your brother, and to begin to introduce that language of humanity as one, which is very strong in African culture, African traditional religions, and Christianity. So when religious leaders across the different faiths speak with one voice, then the followers can begin to start to change. So that's the potential of intervention. And when religious leaders condemn something together and say the rape of women in the DRC by soldiers, we will never approve of that, and we hold them accountable, and they're very categorical in standing for those things, then it sends a message because they have so much power over their constituencies. And sorry, I forgot the first one, and I'm not sure whether I've answered both of them.
I think you did, and maybe we are a bit running off time. No, Joanna?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you to all. I really wish we could actually go much more in depth. If there are any immediate responses, very short, let's say 1 minute, then I invite them. Otherwise, we have to wrap up. Any immediate responses?
Well, I'd just like to say something, and maybe it's a question, Joanna, and we can use it to keep going the conversation after this panel closes, because what Notando was just saying is very interesting in terms of strategies, and Pascal has also talked about strategies. But so maybe next, if we continue the conversation, if Tanisha, sorry to ask you another question, but if you could also address then afterwards sort of what these different types of rebel groups, what that means in terms of strategy to ensuring compliance, if it's one group or the other. And I'm also wondering, and it's a question maybe to everyone, because you speak a lot about non-state armed groups, but whether these criteria and some of these considerations also actually apply to state armed forces. And is there really such a stark difference between, religious rebels and religious groups, or maybe resource rebels and center-seeking groups? Because state armed forces will always, by nature, of course, be center-seeking and secessionist and so on. So what strategies that would, what it would mean in terms of strategies, and whether it also can be applicable to some state armed forces? Maybe some points we could keep talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tanisha, I hate to be doing this, basically tell you that you can't reply to this amazing questions and engage further, but, and here is the big but, I invite the entire audience and all of us to continue the conversation in the specific Zoom room that you should see a button for it, and let's all move there and continue the conversation, because it has been fascinating. It's always immensely complex to sum up such a rich conversation. I won't say fascinating, because I abuse that word, but what I will say is that what this panel has shown today is the great value in bringing in perspectives from scholarship and practice. And there is the need for both of for both of this, as well as for bringing in perspectives from various disciplines to understand compliance. And something that Jean-Marie said, I want to pick up and conclude with that. Compliance will never be perfect. Compliance with IHL will never be perfect because of the fields that we're talking about. Not even compliance with normal domestic law in normal peace times is perfect. So we do have to take that into account. So it's a question about strengthening compliance. It's not possible to make it perfect. And therefore, we need these various disciplines, and we need insights from practice and scholarship. And with that, I'm very, very grateful to all panelists for your contributions, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you.
Thanks to
Thank
the
you,
organizers as
Jonas
well.
and fellow panelists. Thank you to all of you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.